Welcome back. This will be the first video in a series of videos about American history to prepare you for the U.S. Regents exam. And if you're interested about learning about U.S. history and you're not taking the Regents, you will still find my videos helpful. I hope. Alright, so let's go. Alright, so it's time to review the United States history and government. So, as you know, United States history is going to be a lot easier than global history. So if you had trouble with global, you'll find that US history is easier because you're only dealing with one country. You're only dealing with one country. And this is just a map of the United States, and I will hope that you're familiar with it. We'll refer to it multiple times as we go through multiple reviews in the series, but this is what you're going to have to deal with when you take the U.S. history regions. There's a lot less geography than as compared to what you had in global, but you still have to know a little bit about geography for the U.S. regions, and it's a really fun subject, and I hope you guys are gonna like it. Alright, let's go. Alright, so the age of exploration. I know I'm diverting a little bit towards global history, but bear with me a little bit because we can't really understand American history without knowing its roots during the age of exploration. So, during the 15th century, Europeans started to get an interest in exploration. And you might remember all this from one of my previous videos about global history. So, why? Curiosity, sense of adventurism, wealth, religion, glory, and land. Of course, land was very important because it was very expensive in Europe. Not everyone owned land, and if you did, you were generally very rich. In Europe, they say that a lord owned the air that the peasants on his land breathed. He owned everything. But not everybody was trying to become a lord, but land ownership was very important to Europeans, and there just wasn't enough of it in Europe. That's why it was very expensive, and money was a huge motivating factor. Search for new routes into Asia. Asia was seen as this big place where you could get rich. You could trade with Asia and you could get rich. So why not? Why did it start in the 15th century? So as you remember, technology, magnetic compass and astrolabe, which was used for navigation, more accurate maps with charts, and gunpowder, which gives Europeans military advantage. Alright, so that was our short review of the age of exploration. I promise I'm going to focus primarily on the age of exploration as it relates to U.S. history, but I thought you guys needed to know that. Alright, so let's move on. England. Alright, so England was a late player in the whole exploration game as compared to Portugal, Spain, and France. When we talk about who discovered America, when we talk about these types of people, we often talk about Christopher Columbus. Although, when it comes to England, there was another third person who should get more recognition. This person gets almost no recognition, but he is just as important as Columbus to this discovery of the New World, to the discovery of America. His name was John Cabot. Well, that's his English name. His real name was Giovanni Caboto. And he was an Italian explorer who moved to England with his family in 1495. So you see his picture. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to find a direct route into Asia, which was similar to what Columbus wanted to do. And King Henry VII agreed to support his journey. And in 1497, John Cabot landed in what's today Canada and claimed it for England. So this kicked off the whole exploration game for England, although it was still very slow as compared to Spain, which was aggressively exploring the New World. Early on, England's primary interest in North America was focused on fishing. And you know, the funny part about it is that in early 1500, England was not even the biggest fishing player in North America, and was getting less fish than Portugal, Spain, and France. You know, he was not even the biggest player in North America. That's the unusual part about it. But you know, the thing about England is that it just didn't care about exploring North America, as opposed to Portugal, Spain, and France had other reasons to explore the New World. But England just didn't care. It was a small island, and its interests were primarily in Europe and not North America. But that changed in the late 1500s due to changes in English economy. England became a big woolen cloth producer, and it was aggressively searching for new markets and spheres of influence. So that's when England really decided to take a look at North America as something that as a place that where they could expand their spheres of influence. Alright, so let's talk about Roanoke. And it was England's first colony in America. And it was founded by Sir Walter Raleigh. It was located at Roanoke Island off the coast of what is today known as North Carolina. In 1585, 116 English settlers set up a colony there. And when expedition came back in 1591, the colonists were missing. They were gone. They were not there. To this day, no one knows what happened to them. Some theories say that they might have moved on to the mainland. Others state that maybe Native Americans just killed them off. There are a lot of theories, and we might never know the true reason as to why 116 English settlers came missing. But this was a failed colony, and it was the first attempt that England made at colonizing America. Jamestown. So let's talk about Jamestown. So under the chapter from King James I, first successful and permanent English colony in North America was established in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Why? They wanted to find gold, route to Asia, and rewarding trade with Native Americans. We have to point out that rewarding, quote-unquote, trade was meant to benefit England and not Native Americans. Alright, so they found no gold, and life in Jamestown was tough. It was a tough life. Disease was rampant, and there was an issue with malnutrition. People were starving, basically, because these settlers had no idea how to survive in the New World. There are a bunch of, adventure-seeking young Englishmen who came to the New World without knowing how to survive. Out of 900 settlers that came between 1607 and 1609, only 60 survived. This colony was not making any profits. And, England was not happy about that. England had a false belief that they could exploit Native Americans in the way the Spanish exploited Aztecs, Mayans, and Incas. But North America had a completely different geography than what the Spanish had to deal with in their territory. So this area was not as densely populated by Powhatan Indian, and it was not easy to conquer them and subject them to your rule. Spain also had an army of conquistadors who had trained soldiers to conquer and priests to help convert the natives. So Spain was a lot more organized in what they wanted to do than England. And unlike Spain, England didn't send any army to the New World, All they did was they sent a bunch of young and untrained settlers with guns who had no idea what they were doing. And it was a whole different ballgame from what Spain was doing with Aztecs, Mayans, and Incas. Well, one of the things that should be known about the English settlers at Jamestown is that they had bad relations with Native Americans almost from the start. At first, as Powhatan Indians saw the English starving, they actually brought them food. They brought them supplies of corn because they felt sorry for them. But were the English grateful for that? No, they would not. The English saw them as barbarians who were not equal to them and thus needed to be subjugated to their rule. So the English made a foolish mistake by raiding the Native American corn supplies. And Native Americans responded by stopping their trade with the English, resulting in mass starvation in Jamestown. So, very foolish mistake. Tobacco. Tobacco might be bad for you, but it was good for early English settlers. It could be argued that without tobacco, Jamestown would have failed as a colony. The discovery of tobacco in Chesapeake soil changed everything. It was known as saltweed and literally saved Jamestown County, the Jamestown County. Many became addicted to it. They knew it was harmful, but it made them money, it made them rich. So, by 1624, Virginia exported about 200,000 pounds of tobacco. That's a lot of saltweed. Yeah. It was very profitable for them. They made a lot of money from it. And without tobacco, Jamestown would have failed as a colony, most likely, because early settlers at Jamestown, they were starving and they had no idea what they were doing, and tobacco changed everything because it's addictive. A lot of Europeans wanted to smoke, specifically the upper class Europeans, and it made them money. So tobacco was their savior. Alright, so let's talk about indentured servitude. You need workers to grow tobacco. To get this labor, Jamestown imported indentured servants, mainly from England and Ireland. What is indentured servitude? Well, it's basically a free trip to America. It was a contract that gave people a free trip to America in exchange for 4 to 7 years of free labor. So it was like this contract where people sold themselves into slavery in exchange for a free trip to America. The only difference is that this slavery was, limited to a certain number of years. And most of them were young men from lower classes. Women who were indentured servants faced sexual abuse and were severely punished for unwanted pregnancies. So their kids would usually be taken away at an early age and put to indentured work, and more years were added to her contract. So, to their contract. So the best and rare hope for these women was when a wealthy man would buy them out of their contract in order to marry her. Most of them happily accepted an offer of buyout for marriage. So, indentured servitude was not easy work, and most died from overwork and disease, men and women. Most indentured servants died from overwork and disease. Even when some servants neared the end of their contract, their masters added more time, and they were supported by local courts. Very few indentured servants saw freedom at the end of their contract. Very few. Conflict with Native Americans. As you already know, early Virginia settlers saw Powhatan Indians as barbarians. The English needed more land to grow tobacco, and so they were constantly fighting each other. So English were constantly fighting with Indians, with Native Americans. There was a temporary cessation of fighting between settlers and Native Americans in 1614 with the marriage of, the famous Pocahontas to John Rolfe. But, and that cessation of fighting didn't last. In 1622, in what became known as the Indian Assault of 1622, Native Americans killed off about a quarter, probably even more than a quarter, of white population in Virginia. So they massacred everybody. Men, women, children. So more than a quarter of white population of Virginia were killed off. After that, Chef, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, Chief of Peckham, she believed that settlers would simply leave. But he was wrong. He was very wrong about settlers. He believed that they would behave as Native Americans would. If when Native Americans defeated another Native American tribe, the defeated tribe would usually leave. But Europeans behaved in a completely different way. So he miscalculated how the English would behave. Not only did the settlers stay, but when resupplied by England, and led by Captain John Smith, who was really upset about the Indian Assault of 1622, and he wanted revenge, they made frequent and brutal military expeditions against Native Americans by killing them and taking more of their land. So it was a very brutal time. Native Americans didn't like the English didn't like Native Americans, but ultimately the English had better technology. They had guns, and which proved to be the difference maker. Life for early settlers in Chesapeake was tough, but it wasn't just true about Chesapeake, it was true about the entire Virginia. So, disease was the primary concern. Disease. Almost no prospect of marriage, especially for men. There were almost 3 times more men than women, so most men who came there were out of luck. And there was high infant mortality. Lots of times babies would die because conditions were terrible. Women were prized, and if a husband happened to die, she would quickly remarry creating large families with step and half siblings. But for the majority of 1600s though, most people who lived there were immigrants rather than native born. Because conditions were so terrible, many would die and be replaced by new English settlers. So people would go there, work for a little bit, die, be replaced. Very few would, live a long and healthy life. In Chesapeake, and actually it's true for Jamestown, it's true for entire Virginia, as a matter of fact, yeah. Okay. Bacon's Rebellion. I promise I'm not going to talk about food. So, Bacon's Rebellion. In 1676, a planter named Nathaniel Bacon led a rebellion against Virginia's governor, Sir William Berkeley. So, what was it? Well, his armed group consisted of planters, runaway indentured servants, and a few slaves. They were upset about what? They didn't like high taxes, they didn't like high tobacco prices, and Berkeley's refusal to have war with Native Americans. They saw Berkeley as being soft towards Native Americans. So, in the winter of 1675 through 76, a group of Native Americans attacked Virginia and killed 36 people. These Native Americans were responding to a previous attack by a group of planters against them. But Bacon's group got really mad after that, and they led a violent attack against both hostile and friendly Native Americans who had nothing to do with that attack. So, Governor Berkeley condemned the attack and declared Bacon a rebel. And what he did? He sent 300 soldiers to get him. He thought it was going to be easy, but it was not. This didn't work, and it started a small civil war in Virginia between Bacon and Berkeley's soldiers. At first, Bacon was actually winning because he captured and destroyed Jamestown, which forced Berkeley to flee. But Bacon's soldiers, it was not an organized army. It was basically a group of militiamen who supported him. But Berkeley's soldiers continued to destroy Native American tribes, but after a little while, his soldiers started going home to work on their crops. So, it was that time of the year to tend their crops. And Bacon, like many Virginians at the time, died of swamp fever, died of disease. So, with reinforcement of over 1,000 English troops, the rebellion was finally crushed, and 24 remaining rebel leaders hanged. So, that was the end of Berkeley's rebellion. A significance of that rebellion was that it showed that the government of Virginia and basically governments of many English colonies were weak in preventing uprisings. Alright. Slavery in the South. Very important topic, guys, so you gotta know it. At first, English colonists only saw two sources of forced labor: indentured servants and enslaved Native Americans. The problem with Native Americans was that many of them died from European diseases. And so there weren't a lot of them to enslave, and they were difficult to capture and enslave. So for the most of 1600s, indentured servants from Europe were a main source of labor. But in the 1600s, a small number of Africans began entering Chesapeake colonies and worked alongside indentured servants. But there were a small number of them there in comparison to indentured servants. So in the 1600s, Africans the number of Africans in Chesapeake colonies was insignificant in comparison to European indentured servants. But in the 1700s, due to England's growing participation in African slave trade and smaller number of indentured servants coming from England, African slaves began to replace indentured servants. And by the 1730s, African slaves constituted an overwhelming majority of Southern labor force. They helped grow tobacco and cotton in large plantations. And many Southerners didn't own slaves. That's also important to know. But that was the beginning of what is known as slavery in the South. This was the beginning. And this began a trend towards African slaves in the South. A trend that only ended with the Civil War. We're going to talk about Civil War later. Triangular trade and the Middle Passage. Alright guys, so you might remember seeing a map similar to this one when you studied global history. So triangular trade, where it was basically, that's when Europeans sent manufactured goods to the New World, got back raw goods and raw products. And Europeans would also go to Africa to get African slaves, and those slaves would be sent to Caribbean through something known as the Middle Passage. That's when they were packed tightly in those ships, and many Africans died in those conditions. But those who made it were usually sent to Caribbean first, and then some of those Africans would be sent to the colonies. So this was the triangular trade and the Middle Passage. That's how the system worked. Massachusetts. As you know, many English settlers in the early 1600s who came to the New World with dreams of getting rich went to Chesapeake. However, there were others who came for religious reasons. They went north to New England and were known as Puritans. They were unhappy with the Church of England and they wanted to purify the religion. But prior to Puritans, another group arrived in Plymouth in 1620. They came on a ship known as Mayflower and were known as Pilgrims. Pilgrims wrote a document known as the Mayflower Compact to govern the Plymouth colony. So, very important that you guys know the Mayflower Compact and its significance. So, what the Mayflower Compact did, it was a document where colonists agreed to elect their own leaders and make their own laws. It was the first democratic government in the colonies. Set up the first democratic government in the colonies. So, the Mayflower Compact. It's very important that you guys know about it. Northern economy. By the mid-1700s, there was a mixed economy in the north. So, northern families cut forests to get timber for ships, houses, barrels, furniture, etc. Small family farms as opposed to large southern plantations made up a large portion of northern economy. Soil was not as fertile and seasons were colder. That's why farms were generally small. They were less dependent on slavery, which was also not as harsh as slavery in the South. Slaves typically worked on farms or as servants. Many of their laborers were also indentured servants. Alright, but we also need to talk about middle colonies. So middle colonies such as New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Similar to northern colonies, they had many small farms, but they had some advantages over the northern colonies had better soil that they took from Native Americans. Basically, they took farmlands where Native Americans already worked, so they had an advantage, as opposed to, colonists in the north had to do everything by themselves. They had to make their own farms. So colonists in middle colonies, they produced products such as corn, beef, pork, and wheat. They actually produced a lot of it, so they could export it. So both northern and middle colonies shipped their products to West Indies and Europe, and they made a lot of money out of that. So that was the basic description of northern economy.
If tomorrow all the things were gone, I'd worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife. I thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom, and I can't take that away. Hey, and I'm proud to be an American, or at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the man who died, who gave that right to me. And I'd gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. From the lakes of Minnesota to the hills of Tennessee, across the plains of Texas, from sea to shining sea, from Detroit down to Houston, and New York to LA. While there's pride in every American heart, and it's time we stand and say, hey, and I'm proud to be an American, or at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the man who died and gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. And I'm proud to be an American, or at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the man who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to him and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.